Hi everybody. Sorry about the extended delay there. Obviously it talks about technology. Technology is going to be our biggest issue of the evening. We're also trying some other interesting stuff tonight, so you may have to bear with us for a while. So welcome and thanks for everybody being on time, unlike me. Welcome to International Alert's Peace Talks. This is the latest in the Peace Talk series, and it's part of our Talking Peace Festival that we're running this year, 2015. It's second time we're running the Talking Peace Festival. We've been running since the 3rd of September, right the way through to the 3rd of October. And we're running a number of events around lots of different strands, so technology, food, art, and talks, which we're doing tonight. We've got an excellent panel here today, some physical, some virtual. We'll introduce you to the panel in a minute. But just a little bit about International Alert. We're one of the biggest peace-building organisations in the world. We've been building peace for around about 30 years. And we're looking at the ways that we can use technology for peace building, and I think that we're trying to not just come up with an app that can stop a bullet, but we'll talk more about that perhaps later. But we're also talking about the ways that we can embed technology into our peace building and amplify our peace building message. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're hoping to get lots of really interesting questions from you guys. It's probably more important that we get some really good input from you. Nobody wants to hear me speak a lot more, so what I will just do now is I'll hand over to our chair, Helena.
Thanks, Dan. So thank you for joining us, and I thought I'd start by introducing myself and telling you a little bit about this whole idea of peace building and technology, and then I'll move on to introducing the panelists that are joining us physically and virtually. There we go. In just a minute. So my name is Helena Puig Larrauri. I'm a member of the board of International Alert. I also co-direct Build Up, which is a social enterprise that works at the intersection of technology, civic engagement, and peace building. We do a number of things. Some of them are projects in the field helping peace building organizations to use technology, much like International Alert is doing in many of their programs. Some of it is to start a global conversation around peace building and technology, and that includes running an annual conference on peace building and technology called Build Peace, which you can look up online if you're interested in finding out more about it. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The panel will be about 45 minutes. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to ask a series of questions to the panelists. After that, we'll be asking for questions from the audience, so from all of you. And we will end the whole session at around 8:30, at which point you're welcome to join us just outside here. Is that right?
Yeah.
Just outside here for pizza and beers and for some networking and maybe some more informal questions. So, peace building and technology. Dan started off by saying it's not just about apps that stop bullets. And when I often go out and do small talks about what peace building and technology is about, and I usually get one of two reactions. You know, the initial reaction is, whoa, peace and technology, that's so cool, which usually means I don't really know what you're talking about. And the second possible reaction is, I don't really know what you're talking about, just directly. And I thought maybe it would be helpful if I could start by giving you 3 ways in which technology contributes to peace-building programs around the world, with a few very simple examples, just to get you thinking in this area. So one of the ways that technology contributes to peace-building programs is with different kinds of data and information technologies. And finding new ways to better understand conflict. So 3 concrete examples of that. There's a local NGO in Sudan called Sudia that a few years ago set up a community communication system that was basically a set of people that had mobile phones along a nomadic route, and they would send text messages into a central database in Khartoum, and this database was managed by the NGO. They would then produce summaries of the text messages that came in and run radio programs that would be feedback to the same nomadic routes. So it was a very simple data system at the local level to try and get people to better understand the conflict local people to better understand the conflict along the nomadic routes. So you have that kind of very local data systems, but then you also have people like the Data Pop Alliance who are working worldwide to look at ways that big data can be used to prevent urban violence. So for example, right now, they're running a program in Bogota that uses called data records to try and better understand the patterns of crime in Bogota. So everything from SMS linking to radio very locally in Sudan to big data and looking at global patterns of urban violence. So that's one use, data to better understand conflict. A second use of technology for peace building is around communications and different uses of communication technologies to counter discourses of violence or discourses of conflict. So this is everything from people who use social media in creative ways to try and counter discourses in a conflict area. One of my favorite examples of this is an organization called the Peace Factory in Israel that basically uses, has a Facebook group that encourages people to put up pictures of themselves with positive statements like Israel loves Iran, that's their most famous one, some of you may have seen it, but also things around friending people for peace, so friending people across conflict boundaries. Another way that communication technologies are used for peace building, there's a lot of citizen journalist sites that focus specifically on countering violent discourse. A very good example of that is Ground Views in Sri Lanka, which has been widely credited for being the only website that was dealing with some very difficult issues during Sri Lanka's transition. So that's communications technologies. And then finally, I think there's a whole set of tools around creating digital networks of peace builders. And a couple of examples of that, there's these for me are actually kind of the most creative probably of all the uses of technology. So there's an organization called Games for Peace in Israel that brings Israelis and Palestinian teenagers together to play Minecraft. And through basic playing together on Minecraft, addresses some of the issues that come up when Israeli and Palestinian teenagers hang out in the real world outside of the game. There's also an organization called Solilla, which started in Egypt and in the US, and they run online exchanges between university students in Western countries and predominantly Muslim countries. And these online exchanges last about 8 weeks. They bring students together on an online platform where they discuss pretty controversial issues and try and build bridges. So these are all positive examples. You can use technology to better understand conflict. You can use it to counter discourses of violence. You can use it to create digital networks of peace builders. Maybe at this point you're thinking I'm being a little bit too positive. Of course, technology is just a tool, and there are many negative uses of technology. So, of course, it can also be used for surveillance. There's a lot of hate speech online. There are a lot of online violence networks and a lot of recruitment, radicalization, polarization that happens online. So to try and explore these questions a bit further about the positive uses of technology and the negative uses of technology, we've got 4 great panelists today. The first one is John Ridpath, and John is the head of product at Decoded. And Decoded work to demystify the digital world for professionals and companies through hands-on learning experiences. And he'll tell you more about his work. Second, we have Nikki de la Rosa, who joins us from the Philippines. And she leads International Alert's program on inclusive political economy and conflict-sensitive economic governance. And she'll be telling us about some of the work that International Alert has done in the Philippines using technology. Third, we have Mariéme Jamme, who's joining us via Skype. And Mariéme is the CEO of Spot On Global Solutions, I hope I pronounced that right, which helps international technology companies selling enterprise software solutions to set a foothold in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And Mariéme is best known for her role in promoting technology, good governance, transparency, and better education standards in Africa. So she'll be talking particularly about those areas. And finally, we have a video recording of a set of questions that Dan asked Jimmy Wales. Jimmy is the co-founder and promoter of the online non-profit encyclopedia, Wikipedia, and the for-profit Wikia web hosting company, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So we're actually going to start with a question that we recorded asking Jimmy Wales, which Dan is going to play. And Dan asked Jimmy how online spaces like Wikipedia give him hope for peace and for peace building.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's very easy to overblow the dangers and to listen to scaremongers about this and that, because the number of people who are using technology and the internet to organize for violence is extraordinarily small. And we don't see any sort of massive uptick in violence around the world caused by this. We've always known there are always bad people in the world who do bad things. But what we have is, for the first time, this overwhelming technology for ordinary good people to communicate with each other, to organize, to build things together, and so forth. And one of the things that we see in my work at Wikipedia is that you can get people together who may have very diverse viewpoints, but they can come together and work together if you have the right cultural environment where, you know, at Wikipedia we always try to be neutral. That doesn't mean the individual editors are themselves neutral on a particular topic, but they understand the concept of neutrality, and Wikipedia should be neutral. So I always give the example of, if you think of a very calm, friendly Catholic priest and a very calm, friendly Planned Parenthood activist, and they're going to write together about abortion, well, they're never going to agree on the fundamentals, but they can come together and collaborate effectively to explain the issue to everyone. So the Catholic priest will understand that Wikipedia can't say abortion is a sin, but they can say the Catholic Church position on abortion is this and such, and critics have responded this, and da-da-da-da, and the Pope said that, and you know, all that sort of thing. And people get that idea, and it's actually something that I feel like has been, in many ways, missing from the traditional media, where there's a far more, sort of, you get more people watching a TV show if you've got two talking and screaming at each other than a sort of a thoughtful dialogue where you're looking for common ground. But that's a lot of what happens online, and technology can facilitate that. It doesn't happen automatically. We need to think about the social spaces that we're building online and how to make them positive and productive, which involves a lot of striking balance. So you want the balance between, you want an open conversation where people are allowed to disagree. At the same time, you have to draw a line and say, yeah, let's disagree about ideas, let's not beat each other up, and so let's behave in a proper fashion. So, wide open, anarchic spaces online tend to be dominated by the most annoying trolls. And places that are too locked down get to be quite boring because nobody, you only let people in who agree with you, so okay, that's not much of a dialogue. So striking that balance is something that I think people are learning how to do, and I think it's very important. No, I think we're still seeing a lot of very rapid evolution of what kinds of places people are, where they are online, what they're doing, how those spaces function, and I think there's still big opportunities, for people to build new spaces that are interesting and kind. So go to any newspaper. That's
it? Okay. That's where that ended.
Sorry.
I wanted to ask a question of Mariéme now. We can have her back. Hi, Mariéme. Thank you for joining us again. And we wanted to start with a question to you. You have spoken about how technology can have a positive impact, particularly for women and girls. So in your experience, how does technology help to redefine gender roles and empower women?
I'm so sorry for the noise. I'm in New York and trying to make this call today. It's so important to me.
No problem.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Great.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you for the question. I'm sorry for the noise. I'm in New York right now. I think your question makes very, very good sense today, which is International Peace Day, but also the week where we're going to be signing the global goals for peace and justice around the world. And my work, I've been working quite a lot for young girls and women around the world, and I think technology is going to play a massive role for women violence and the fact that many young women today across Africa are suffering for violence, for rape, for kidnapping and lack of education. And I think that our work is very focused on empowering young girls to be able to build applications, to teach them how to code, and to make sure they have access to technology, access to internet, access to information. So that's what we've been doing so far.
And how do you think that increasing the access of young girls to technology and to being able to build apps, to code, etc., how do you think that has an impact on gender-based violence, as you were mentioning?
I think I missed that.
Sorry, do you want to? Should I just come here? Okay.
Right.
You were just saying that you've been working to increase the access of young women and girls in Africa to coding and to different applications to technology. How do you think that that can have an impact on gender-based violence?
I think that before we start doing the coding and teaching young girls how to code and how to get access to information, we have many young girls who are into science and technology and mathematics, but I think they didn't quite understand that building software solutions and building applications can help them be safe. So in Senegal, for example, in Uganda, we have young girls who are building tools, technological solutions for rape, violence, for example, for alert systems where they can be safe between them, and they can also talk about sexual violence, for example, and they can talk about physical violence. And I think the impact is huge. The fact that they can now have access, and they can actually build the tools themselves is very, very powerful. So those are the impacts we're having on the ground. And we're looking to have 1 million young women and girls by 2020 to start coding and understanding the role of peace and the role of justice. And I think every single girl growing in Africa should understand that. So I think technology will play a great role.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. We're going to ask a few more questions to our panelists, and we'll come back to you with another question in a bit. So our next question was for Nikki. And Nikki, the International Alert Program in the Philippines runs an online conflict monitoring system that has had some very positive results. So can you tell us a bit about how the system works and who set it up, how it's going?
Hi. Yeah, we developed a pioneering data conflict monitoring system in the Philippines, and I think this is also pioneering in Southeast Asia. We've developed it around the time when the government of the Philippines signed the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro in 2012, because there is a lack of disaggregated data at the subnational level in terms of looking at emerging sources of conflict and issues around persistent clan violence and the rising criminality, like for example robbery and or damage to property. Data in the Philippines is national in coverage and does not really look at Mindanao in terms of the subnational context. So what we did was to develop an online system, and this has both a public platform and an offline platform where we capture incidents of violence in terms of actors, causes, whether it's rebellion-related or political conflict, resource-based, whether the shadow economy-related, and so on and so forth. We also look at costs of conflict, both human and economic cost. The main source of our database is the police report, and this is supplemented by media reports. So we have about 15 local media sources plus one national daily. And we triangulate this with our multi-stakeholder validation group at the local level in southern Mindanao, because to answer the issue of unreported cases of violence. So we do this with our partner academic institutions. They are at the front line of harvesting and encoding data from police and media sources and facilitating the multi-stakeholder validation groups, which are composed of local experts and local leaders who have knowledge on the issues on the ground. So we have 3 multi-stakeholder validation groups at different geographical levels. And so we run this. We developed the database from scratch, actually. It's quite fascinating that we were able to do this at less, using lesser resources because softwares are expensive. We've been running this for 2 years already, and so we've done a lot of outreach, and I think we've done some good work in terms of really putting into the public discourse issues of why conflict endures even after a final peace agreement is signed. And we've had that experience in 1996 when the government has signed a peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front, and then we see a lot of community level conflict. So the objective really here is to ensure that the transition, following the peace agreement, will be well managed by local communities, and that approaches by development agencies and the national government as well and local governments would be informed by these emerging trends and emerging sources of conflict. So that's the objective of our initiative in the Philippines. And we're looking at expanding this at Southeast Asia in terms of looking at transitions in Myanmar and around Indonesia or southern Thailand, for example.
Great, thank you. Thanks for telling us about that very interesting program. And John, Decoded's learning experiences are very popular across different organizations. In many ways, you're democratizing access to technology. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you think better access to digital technologies can positively influence peace building. We just heard from Mariéme about young girls in Africa building apps that can help promote safety or go against gender-based violence. We heard from Nikki about a very specific program that built a database that is really helping monitor conflict in the Philippines. So if all peace builders could code, how would it change things?
Well, I have no idea that these projects existed, and as a sort of coder, I wouldn't necessarily think of them myself, and that's why I think we're about sort of democratizing technology and access to technology. There's a great exhibition at the Science Museum at the moment I went to last week, and you get to walk through the history of communication. If you're like me and you like seeing undersea cables, and here you probably don't, but I really like that, kind of going and looking at this kind of amazing stuff and how technology has kind of iteratively been kind of building up, and I think it's focused on communication. That is one of the themes you talked about, is this communication theme. And throughout that history, there's all these moments where it was optimists coming together and actually thinking, you know what, this should be for everyone. So the personal computer was a big, people saying, everyone should be able to do stuff with technology. Everyone should be able to own their own device and do stuff with it. Same with the internet, but the early internet and the early World Wide Web and versions of it were created by a load of Grateful Dead fans and total hippies who were like really, really passionate. This stuff should be for everyone and could change the way society worked. And actually, when you get to the birth of the World Wide Web, people like Sir Tim Berners-Lee, they created technology that was designed to be easy. It was designed to be simple for anyone to build a website and get their message out there independently on their own server, not having to go via some other huge corporation to get their message out there, not having to go via traditional media. And I think that's a really, really empowering, positive message. And it's a shame that throughout the years, technology's kind of made it easier for us to opt out of learning how to be the kind of the creators. And I think everyone should at least give it a go and experience it. And I'm sure if peace builders could not necessarily become the developers of the final solutions, but at least, figuring out better ideas, having a better understanding of technology, I think that's a really positive place to be.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think it also is very close to a lot of what International Alert is trying to do, also a lot of what we do at Build Up. International Alert, I'm just going to do a small plug for you guys because they're actually running a series of peace hacks in 5 different cities. And the idea of the peace hacks, part of it is peace builders can come up with challenges to throw at a bunch of hackers who over 36 hours do what hackers do at hackathons. That's great. But it's also actually an educational exercise. Bringing peace builders closer to coding and bringing coders closer to peace building so that people like you hear about these challenges and these projects, but also so peace builders can see what coding looks like and can feel like they also own that space. They can propose things. They might not be the best coders, but they understand how coding works. And I think that's incredibly important, as you were saying. So that's all great, positive contributions of technology to peace, but obviously it's not all positive. So Dan also asked Jimmy Wales, what he had to say about how online spaces contribute to polarization and radicalization. So let's hear that for now.
One of the problems that we get into in that area is that people who are at risk of becoming violent extremists ensconced in a bubble, and they get a lot of self-reinforcing messages with each other and so on, and they're not likely to rock up on a peace NGO organization to talk about how to solve the problems, right? There's got to be some bridge building and things like that, but of course the risk there is you don't really want to bridge build to actual terrorists, right? That may not be productive or helpful in any way, and you end up looking silly, because some of these people are quite bad. They actually aren't interested in peace, and it becomes very tricky. So I think there is a space. I mean, I do think that one of the great things, as I said earlier, these things don't happen automatically. And so having people out there who say, actually, we need to be talking about what are the causes of violence, what are the ways to reach out and rescue kids who are disillusioned, who are at risk of being sort of manipulated into becoming a suicide bomber or what have you. How do we reach them before that and give them a positive vision, an alternative where they feel like there is, a lot of times people, they end up in these kinds of situations because they see it as their one chance to actually have an impact. Well, it's a pretty bad way of having an impact, right? There's actually positive things to do, and so let's engage around that. But it's not, I don't mean to trivialize it. This is a global sort of opportunity, and there's so many different facets to it, so many different things people get wound up about to become violent extremists, that it's hard to have a simple recipe.
So that's probably, one of the first things that comes.
Sorry.
No problem. Should we get Mariéme back? Yeah. So that's probably one of the first things that comes into people's minds when we talk about negative uses of technology around peace and conflict. But there are other issues that are perhaps less obvious initially. So, Mariéme, I thought we'd ask you that. Can you hear me? Yeah? Oh, maybe not.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great, fantastic. So when we work with peace builders to introduce technology, one of the issues that we discuss often is that the new biases that tech-enabled solutions bring to peace-building work. So particularly access to technology is biased towards more urban, more educated, and wealthier people. And that usually means bias towards men, usually, right? And so we wanted to know, what is your experiences with biases in access to technology?
Can you hear me?
Do you want to? Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one of the things we really need to bear in mind is that technology is borderless, and we need to make sure that people in villages across Africa have good access to technology. And what we're pushing right now is that when there's a subject matter, very important matter like peace and justice, where you have child soldiers wandering around Sudan, young girls in Senegal suffering from mutilations, from so many bad things that happen. They don't have peace, they don't live in peace. We need to really look into how we can create synergies. I like what you said earlier about hackathons. How can we create a synergy between the subject matters, the professional of people who understand really what peace means and technologies. I think there is a gap sometimes between the non-data and the data people, that's what I call them. So I think we need to start thinking about that moving forward. And one of the biggest issues we find is that you have people really, they grasp the whole idea of peace and justice, but they don't think technology will help. I can definitely say that technology will can play a massive role in empowering local people, gathering them in a room, asking what they think. So what peace means to you is different to what peace means to me. Peace means something completely different to a young girl, for example, like myself growing in Senegal, have no peace and no justice for my causes. But it could be something completely different to somebody living in the West or living in a different part of the world. So we need to just bear in mind that technology can play a massive role, but we need to dig deep and look into the impact it could make on people's life.
Do you have any tips or any experiences from your work on how to bridge this the digital divide that is often present, particularly in some African countries where access to technology is very biased towards urban, wealthier people? What have you done to try and bridge this digital divide?
I just heard that what did we do? What did we need to bridge the gap, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so we usually organize hackathons, we organize workshops, we try and really speak to African government, civil society, and businesses to, to again give access to, for example, internet, give access, for example, to information, to open the APIs. Right now, we're working on some very, very important data issues across the continent, where we think that, for people to understand what peace and justice means, for example, we need to open the APIs. We need to open, information that people can have access, very basic information people can have access. So we're working with the government, the civil society, and women groups. For example, in my country, we're working with the women lawyers, for example, to start giving us information for young girls who are being raped at 9 years old. So many people don't understand this, but I think that young women can't have peace and justice around the world if they don't know their basic rights. So we're trying to crowdsource, the human rights of the girls in Senegal, but also inform them of what their rights should be. Should they have, should they suffer, for example, for domestic violence or for very basic violence within families?
Thank you. Thanks for that, Mariéme. So we've talked about the dangers of radicalization, polarization, some of the dangers around lack of access or biased access to technology. Nikki, another negative aspect of introducing technology is a common criticism of tech-enabled conflict monitoring systems in particular, such as the one that you were telling us about, is that early warning is only as good as the early response that you get. In other words, you can have a great conflict monitoring system, but if nobody's going to do anything about this information, it doesn't really have an effect on the ground. So I was wondering whether you could tell us what response you've seen from the system that you run, and if you could specifically mention whether you think that other digital technologies could be used to make early response better.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add that technology is only as good as the data it contains. No? That's why with our conflict monitoring system, we really take pains in ensuring that we have robust and we have credible data into the database. We supplement the technology with a lot of outreach sessions to disseminate the findings that we have. We write thematic briefs. We do face-to-face interactions with people who are affected by conflict. And so we do a lot of work with local government units, for example, to embed the database into their planning process and into their peace and order councils, because at the local level in the Philippines, we have a peace and order council. And we want to inform that process and to ensure that they transition from being reactive in terms of just reacting to a specific incident of violence to a more proactive approach in terms of, for example, targeting or prioritizing areas where there's high level of violence, or deploying actions that in critical junctures, for example, in the 12-month period, the database allows you to look at the trends of conflict and where the spikes are. So we have 5-year panel data, and we've seen that, for example, usually during election time or before the school term starts in June, or agricultural lean months, September, October, or even during Ramadan period, that there's the 4-year trend really looks at spikes in those months. So it helps, for example, local governments to deploy specific actions in specific periods of time within a 12-month period. It also informed CSR programs, for example, of private sector. Mm-hmm. We have a geotagging facility of the database, and so there's heat signatures, for example. So it informs security and risk assessment of NGOs or even private sector. We do a lot of analytical work in terms of developing additional complementary methodologies. For example, we've developed a violence intensity index because we wanted to make an argument that looking at specific incidences of conflict is not enough. We should look at the magnitude in terms of human cost or economic cost. And so we've been able to do an index for that specific purpose. And local government units, for example, and national agencies have used that to target actions or to deploy resources in areas where it's needed. We've also developed a thematic paper on conflict strings because, again, we wanted to make an argument that, NGOs, for example, doing peace-building work or development practitioners or local government units or the national government, for example, looks at how conflict morphs. Whether actors, in the morning we see incidences that they are victims in the morning and retaliation happens, revenge, and the cycle of revenge. So in the afternoon, for example, or the next day, they become the perpetrators. Mm-hmm. So it's important for local conflict resolution mechanisms to look at these incidences of conflicts and what specific causes of conflict, for example, has the highest propensity to morph into conflict strings, or for actors to, morph into something else during a specific period of time. Because in our context, we see a lot of clan-based violence that, for example, started with land issues and morphs into something else because most of these are also political actors. So during election period, it becomes a political-based violence and so on. What I'm saying is that we complement technology with other ways of, putting this discussion forward and for collective analysis and collective strategy development, for example, on conflict management and conflict resolution, especially at the point where we're transitioning towards a post-conflict scenario after the peace agreement has been signed. Moving forward, we're looking at expanding the coverage of our conflict database to look at the 5 other provinces outside of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao because we wanted to look at other rebellion-related issues. For example, we still have a long-running communist insurgency, and the government's not paying attention to that. There's no appetite for the resumption of the peace talks. So we wanted to push that in terms of giving evidence of what's happening in those other provinces. So before the end of the year, we will have panel data of 4 years in 10 provinces in Mindanao. So that completes the whole picture of the conflict terrain in the southern part of the Philippines. We're also thinking of developing an app that's mobile, cell phone based, because challenges in the Philippines, in Mindanao, there's still low penetration of internet access, and energy problem is still problematic in some areas, but mobile subscription is really high in terms of penetration, so we have about 50%. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at, developing an app that allows individuals to report cases of violence, but we will go a second step in terms of developing a system that allows triangulation of data. So for example, if the police reports that or the media reports that and then an individual reports that, then it goes into the database. Because it's also important for us to ensure that data that's there is also verified and it's not just anecdotal. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of innovation that we're thinking, but at the end of the day, really, technology for us, it's to ensure that people participate and people get to be part of a collective analysis, but at the end of the day, the technology is only as good as when it's developed with people who are directly affected by the conflict. And so we're just ensuring that there's a balance there in terms of our efforts on the data, on the conflict monitoring system in the Philippines.
So a lot of participation in the reporting of data, and then you've talked a little bit about how that's used to influence planning, to allocate resources, to make strategic decisions about conflict prevention programming. Mm-hmm. Have you thought at all, or is there any thinking around any technology-enabled response to conflict? Is that something that you're considering, or is it mainly just in the early warning side?
We don't even think about our system as early warning, only because we want to safeguard, hard military and hard security approach into the use of the database. So we have a time lag of 2 weeks, for example.
So it's much more. That's why you were saying conflict monitoring very clearly.
Yeah,
okay.
But our thinking now is really to ensure that individuals get to participate in reporting incidences of violence, because we see, police reports, it's our main source of data, but it's politicized at some level. So there's a lot of unreported cases, and we really want individuals to be able to safely participate in that. So we're still in the thinking process on how to do that. But in terms of technology-based response, we've only developed a methodology and violence intensity index and all that, but we do a lot of analytical work, but not yet on thinking about the technology-based response.
That's great.
Yeah, but radio, for example, is also, we're thinking about ensuring that there's also use of that media in terms of reporting incidences of conflict. So we're thinking of ensuring that opinion makers, the analysis that we have from the conflict monitoring system gets fed into people in radio, because there's a lot. We're very, it's important for us that the database is used not to depict the other as, in a negative light, but just to ensure that understanding the nuances of the context in Mindanao is put out there in terms of the discourse and the debates.
And of course, in other conflict monitoring systems that are similar to what you're talking about, there have been some attempts at using technology to also help early response. So the example I was giving earlier of Sudan, this community communication system, it's essentially a conflict monitoring system. You have people on the nomadic routes in Sudan reporting about incidents of conflict, but they also have a feedback mechanism. So anybody who reports in also gets back a summary of what everyone else is saying, and that summary also goes to a local radio that runs a radio program. So similar to what you're saying. There's also a system in Kenya run by an organization called Sisi Niamani. It's called Peace Text, and that is very much about response. What they do is when they get a report of incidences of rising tension, not quite, so that really is an early warning system. They then send out text messages to people in a particular area calling for peace. So there are a few examples of early response uses. So last question, John. You spoke earlier about the good things that come from greater access to technology, democratization of communication technologies, etc. But that also means greater access to things like the darknet. And so we just wanted to ask you how you think that affects peace. So what are some of the impacts of the darknet on efforts to build peace?
Well, it's interesting to hear Jimmy in his recorded video talking about these kind of, I can't remember how he phrased it, but these kind of ghettos online, where you kind of get these very tight communities, very radical extremist groups. And I don't know if who's been on tour?
Yep.
A few people. Like, you won't find many places that are, there's some really terrible ghettos on there, really nasty communities. Very quickly you're on a place where you can be buying false identities, you can be buying drugs, hiring hitmen, doing all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of news articles about this, but again, I'm a bit of an optimist, and when it comes to technology, as you probably guessed. And there's the dark web specifically, it's just a tool to enable anonymity online. And the ability, it's a bit like a web browser, for everyone who hasn't used it, except you go to these weird addresses that look like 2469d8q.onion instead of going to bbc.com or whatever. And you go to these addresses, and those people can host files in a way that's it's difficult to find out where physically it's being hosted, and very difficult to trace back you as a visitor to those sites. So it doesn't take much of a leap to see why that's an amazing tool in conflict situations. The ability to conduct communication online in an anonymous way is very, very empowering. I know the UK government, no one knows what David Cameron actually said about encryption, as I've found out. But apparently he said he was going to ban encryption, but then he didn't really say that, apparently. But I'm very worried about that discussion. I think it links into the dark web. The dark web sounds nasty and evil because it's the dark web. But this talk of banning encryption is exactly the same debate. It's a debate about whether we should be allowed to communicate with each other in privacy, online, and in anonymity. Personally, big believer that that's a very empowering thing, and we should be allowed to talk privately online. And again, you can see why in conflict that would be incredibly powerful. I was making a list of other technologies as well, some of the kind of latest, coolest technologies, and just looking at some of the news, like 3D printing. A few years ago, we had the first 3D printed gun. In March this year, there's a great news story about a guy from Ireland who's out in Jordan using 3D printing technologies, his knowledge of them, to print prosthetic limbs to help with the crisis out there. Drones, they're causing all kinds of deaths and casualties all over the world at the moment. It's a terrible, terrible thing that's happening. There's a great project that Alan shared with me, micromappers. So people are actually using drones to sort of drive over kind of conflict zones and take live video feeds, and then the crowd can click where they see a damaged building and mark that. And then,
can I add one to that?
Yeah.
There's also the Syria Airlift project, which is working with Syrian refugees on the border between Syria and Turkey to build tiny homemade drones and fly them into Syria with messages of hope. It's one of my favorite examples.
That's brilliant. That's lovely.
And the UN recently started using drones as part of their peacekeeping operations, and there are some problems with that. But they are essentially surveillance drones that help protect civilians. And there's a lot of issues with that, but there's some very good stuff about it as well. Sorry.
No, that sounds fascinating. I mean, you just don't need to look very long. You just start Googling and you'll find positive uses for any technology. It's just what I did. Artificial intelligence is an interesting one. So there's like kind of the rise of artificial machines are coming. They're going to take our jobs. They're going to, power the next wave of killing machines, and that is all terrifying. And Stephen Hawking is right to worry. But at the same time, it's powering Google Translate. It's powering Skype Live Translate. So you can now talk to someone anywhere in the world and have given that you've got internet access, okay, nearly there, and you can have your conversation live translated, which is amazing for building bridges across different language barriers. And my last one is virtual reality, because I thought there surely can be no good use for virtual reality. It's just a sort of tool for making us more isolated and lost in technology. But actually, there's a recent thing around Ferguson in the States, and someone's created this virtual world, so you can go to the site of the Ferguson shooting and actually kind of see it from different angles, hear different eyewitness accounts, and really kind of get your head into that situation. Not quite a conflict situation, perhaps, but again, it kind of shows that ability to sort of hopefully build bridges across the world and get into other people's
And I'm
shoes.
going to help you out with the artificial intelligence ones.
Okay.
The virtual reality one.
Yeah.
Which is there's a fantastic research project going on at the University of Barcelona, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, that is, it's basically this virtual reality scene where you go in and you meet a Palestinian, and it's targeted at basically at Israeli youth. And all that happens is you go in and they mirror your body language.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of research on how having someone mirror your body language makes you feel better about them. So it's quite an interesting project. We had a presentation about it at the conference we organized. There's also a project called The Enemy, which is this immersive virtual reality experience that shows you two sides of a conflict in the same virtual reality space. So you look in one direction and you see someone from Pakistan in Kashmiri, Pakistani. You look on the other side, you see Indian Kashmiri, and you sort of feel the differences in that. So completely agree with you. You don't have to look very far to see positive uses as well.
Which is why I think everyone should know about it, so that the good guys can also be kind of involved in actually shaping what technology is used for and seeing those kind of creative applications, this kind of maker movement, this idea that anyone can contribute. I think just more reason for the right people to be learning this stuff and tinkering with it.
So we were supposed to end with the negatives, but actually it seems we've ended with more positives, which is totally fine. And I think we'll now open it up to questions from the audience. So does anybody have questions for any of the three of us, or for Mariéme, who's still with us? Yes.
I just wonder what...
You've got a mic right in front of you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's David Turner. I just wonder what the panel thinks is the role of the UN, and especially what is the role of the modern UN in the world we live in today. I have opinions, but...
Okay. But you're doing a question, which is great. We love it. So who wants to take that first? The role of the UN, perhaps since it's a panel about technology, we can sort of focus on the role of the UN in the future and in the uses of technology. Mariéme, if you want to speak, just wave at the camera and we'll put the volume on. Okay, she wants to speak. Go for it. Do you want to do that? Yeah. Yes. Tell us.
Well, I don't know what the role of the UN is. I don't want to speak for the United Nations. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the UN, but one thing I know that we are here today in New York for a very important week where we're going to be pushing for the global goals, for the system of the global goals, and one of the goals is peace and justice. We're going to make sure that technology is part of that conversation as soon as they finish signing the goals this week. I think they started to understand that technology will play a role. Technology will play a massive role in creating and making this goal sustainable. So I don't want to talk on their behalf, but I think as activists and technologists, we're going to make sure that technology is going to will play a role in informing people, in creating solutions that can eradicate uncertainties in countries, making sure child soldiers have got access to information of their right. So many things that we are planning to do, and informing them and creating a synergy between the tech communities and the United Nations. So that's what we're trying to do here.
Thanks, that's great. Does anybody else want to comment on this?
I guess so. I never thought I'd be asked a question about the UN before. I think that there's definitely a place for some kind of international body that actually has an eye on technology as it performs around the world. Because I think there are these huge moral debates we're facing with all the technologies we've talked about, and actually there's no one really making the rules. There's within each country you've got corporations who have quite a lot of say. The kind of the Googles of the world who can sort of make their own sort of moral judgments about what is okay in their world. And then you have governments, which are the only thing that the Googles and the Ubers of this world are scared of, is government regulation, really, frankly. And so the powerful thing about technology is it is kind of free and it kind of moves around and has this amazing pace. But certainly I think as we get to the darker sides of it, especially when you're talking about things like artificial intelligent weapons and like Terminator-style robots, I would like an international body that's just, on our side, the sort of side of sanity, frankly. There's already some quite worrying stuff about, now I've got a friend who worked, well, I can't say where he worked, a government defence contractor in Cheltenham. They have a big silver round building there. And his kind of sort of inside scoop on this is actually, in terms of cyber attacks, it will be illegal for someone to poison a water supply to a city in part of a conflict, but it's not illegal for someone to use a cyber attack to take out their nuclear power plant facilities and then take out the whole kind of grid system, apparently. Mm-hmm. So it's actually the kind of certain countries who, and actually the US and the UK are a number among them, have actually got quite a sort of free rein to do what they want with cyber attacks at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's something certainly that worries me slightly, and it's just a case of other countries beginning to up their capabilities, another kind of arms race, if you like, in the brewing. So that's not a very structured answer. That's but great. I think we need some kind of international force, I think, for good.
Force for good.
Yeah.
On technology.
Yeah.
Nikki, do you have any other comments?
Maybe just to add a bit that for us, in our context, Freedom of Information Bill, for example, has been really problematic. Our government has not signed, has not legislated. So access to information is really still problematic in our country. And so I don't know if, that can be pushed by the UN the way our Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was pushed by the UN DRIP or
yeah.
That's my only answer to it.
I'm going to answer this one as well, and I'm also going to out myself as a former UNDP staff, which colors my answer. I think that one thing that the UN continues to have in a lot of conflict and post-conflict countries is incredible access, and the ability to. So when I worked in a UNDP program, I could access a lot of people that I certainly can't now that I work for a small enterprise. Even I think working at large international NGOs, it's something similar. And in parallel to that, the UN has set up in a number of different areas, policy areas, including in peace building, some very interesting innovation spaces where they're starting to experiment with technology. And I think that's great to see. And given that they have access and that they have the willingness to innovate, there's a lot that can be done. So that's my positive side. The not so great side is that I think that the UN has, there's a lot of willingness to innovate when it comes to track 3 peace building. So that's grassroots peace building, if you're not versed in peace building lingo. So that's, people talking to people. but not so much willingness to innovate when it comes to track one, formal negotiations. Formal negotiations are still the purview of the United Nations. They have it in closed rooms with the boring parties or the governments, usually outside of the country where a conflict is happening. And there's less willingness to innovate there and to use technology to support participation. And I think that's something that I would like to see the UN doing more of personally. So, more questions? Yes.
I have a question for Mariéme.
Yeah.
Hello, good evening, Mariéme. I am Lizelle Bugtay from International Alert Philippines. One of our challenge in the conflict monitoring system is the access on gender data, because in the Philippines we have a very good law on protection of women and children. However, one of the consequences, unintended actually, is they don't give the data on gender for public, and unlike to the blotter reports that we're using for the conflict monitoring system. So maybe if Mariéme can share what will be the good strategy or actions to be taken in accessing data on gender for our conflict monitoring system. Thank you.
Great. Did you hear that okay, Mariéme?
Not really, a little bit.
Can I try to paraphrase you? Our colleague is coming from International Alert in the Philippines, and she was explaining that in their conflict monitoring system, they are looking at data from the police, is that right? And this data does not contain data on gender, because the data protection law in the Philippines does not allow for data on gender to be shared publicly. So they were wondering if you have any ideas about strategies to get better data on gender for their conflict monitoring system.
She's asking around the data for gender, right?
Yes, that's right.
Right. So one of the, we don't have, I mean, when we went to Colombia, we were trying to work right with the Colombian government to see how we can use the same methodology for Africa. The problem we have in the continent is that when it comes to gender equality as a gender equality, we don't have a lot of data. The NGOs actually own this data. The intelligence is owned by NGOs. So the African governments don't actually have really data to, even if they have data, then it's very fragmented right now. So it's very difficult right now for us to have very accurate data on gender equality, and that includes peace and justice as well. So one of the things we're trying to work on right now is to have access to the APIs from the telecom companies in some of the, like Rwanda or Senegal and Botswana, where we can just look at a sample of data, we can visualize and help the government with. But sadly, we don't have really a very big set of metadata where we can look and to prevent gender violence, for example. But we have some organizations working on gender issues. They have some samples of data. But this is one of our biggest challenges. That's why I said earlier that the global goals and the sustainable development goals will play a massive role. If the United Nations want to be credible, in really improving gender equality, including peace and justice in the next 15 years, is one of the biggest challenges to force African government to open the APIs, but also look into the current data we have for peace and justice and for gender equality. This is the biggest challenge. Other than that, we can't really measure gender equality in the next 15 years, but also peace and justice when it comes to young women and girls. So this is a challenge. As global citizens, we need to push for this conversation to go in the head of the United Nations leaders.
Thanks, Mariéme. And I think what you're pointing to is this need for increased transparency, right? And what you're talking about is this tension in between data privacy laws and transparency. And so, I don't know, I'm going to sort of build on what Mariéme was saying to say one of the things that I've seen a few systems do in other places that are trying to look specifically at gender-based violence is to, where they can't get gender data on the raw data, to ask for aggregate data on gender issues specifically, and use that to cross-reference with the databases they're using. I don't know if that would be helpful also. Other questions? Yes. That's you. Yeah, in the tie. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kieran. Thank you very much, Nikki, for sharing your experience in the Philippines and in terms of using data to inform policy. I'm just wondering if you could say a word or two about the impact that you've seen and how you've measured it and how the data feeds into yet better policy making.
Our database is really very young. No, it's just 2 years, but in terms of impact and how we've measured it, a lot of the things that we've done is really to look at coverage, for example, at media, or the uses of the database at local government units or the private sector, or even at global level. So for example, we have a built-in system where we can track who the users are. So to date, we have about 32 countries already accessing our database. And a good portion of this, about 30%, is from Europe. Next, the US, and then Asia, and then Australia. These are a lot of risk consulting firms, private sector, agricultural companies, international NGOs, and even international governments. So, you know, it signifies to us that we need to have the database be used at the local level more. You know, a lot of the uses that we get are from international organizations, and so we are planning to do more, making it more accessible in terms of maybe creating a 2-minuter about our thematic briefs, and maybe it's too academic. So we'll have to make the analysis more accessible. But we do target specific users because of the context of the peace process. So we work a lot with local government units and with local agencies like the Mindanao Development Authority, for example, to help them think through about what specific strategies or what specific programs they can do in this transition process, especially in relation to the Bangsamoro, but also because we have national elections coming up and we see that there will be a spike of violence. We see that already now with organized crimes, kidnap for ransom, etc. And so there's a lot of talks at local government units on how to address these issues in the run-up to the elections in May. So there's a lot of response locally, but in terms of the use of the website, we need to do more work on that aspect because it's a lot of international organizations.
I want to just add one thing onto what you're sharing, Nikki, because you used a very particular word. You said, what is the impact? And I think, I've been in peace building for a while, and asking peace builders on the ground to measure impact is one of the most difficult, also at times annoying things that a donor can do, because it's incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah.
If you add to that, adding the impact of technology on peace building, it's even more difficult. And so, sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, Jen, but my colleague Jen Welch, who's at the front here, is doing her PhD on technology and peace building. And one of the things she's found is that there's actually very little academic research on the impact of technology in peace building. And that her literature review ended up being basically a bunch of blog posts by peace builders on the ground mostly, and a few scattered papers. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to be done in developing a methodology that really gets to the core of what you're saying. I think what Nikki's trying to do is say, look, this is kind of what we're seeing, but a full answer to your question is probably not possible right now, I would say. We're going to take 2 more questions. Yeah, right here.
My name is Charles Appleby from the International Association for Human Values here in the UK. I really was very interested in the examples, particularly from Nikki, but they seem to me to be quite complex. What I'm interested in is your views, really, on what would be something very simple that would make a real difference. I mean, for me, something like WhatsApp is incredibly easy to use. It's incredibly powerful, and by setting this up in the right way, this or other very simple, similar tools, I believe that some of these can make a huge difference just by basically setting up, collecting very simple information from lots of people. So my question is really, what are your thoughts on what are those really simple things that would actually make a real difference using technology in peace building, using this type of thing?
Thank you.
Before I came here, we were talking in our office about how do you make peace building or conflict analysis second nature. Mm-hmm. It's quite difficult to answer because, how do you make it an everyday reality in terms of monitoring what's happening around you or looking at people's perception on security. But what we're trying to do at the moment is making the use of technology more personal in terms of, reporting incidences of violence at the local level. And again, we are looking at using mobile phones to do that. And so probably before the end of the year, I'll have a better answer for you, but we're still developing that. The conflict database seems complex, but it's really not in terms of how we've developed it is hopefully, the web platform allows users to run descriptive statistics in real time. We've developed for researchers, for example, they can download the CSV file in Excel format and run their own statistical, models with it. So I think it's just a matter of ensuring that people understand the uses of this database. And so it becomes simple and less complex in terms of how people perceive it. Mm-hmm. I think we need to do a lot of work on that.
John, did you want to say anything on that?
Well, I think it's interesting to bring up WhatsApp. I think there's a load of great platforms that already exist, and it feels like, I get very excited by things like virtual reality, of course, but it feels like it's getting access, firstly, actually just, is there an internet connection and a device there? Mm. Smartphones are so cheap now. There was that really stupid Facebook thing that racist people were sharing about migrants having smartphones and how should they be allowed to have a smartphone, and actually going through, these are quite cheap devices, pretty much. So actually I think it's getting internet, getting people on these devices. There's probably disagreement from someone who knows far more about the realities in Africa than I do. But I think it feels like access to these technologies feels like once you've got that, you've got a web browser, you've got a basic messaging app. Feels like that's kind of all you need to start building.
Yeah. Mariéme, I think you've got something to add.
Yeah. I think we need to think about also capabilities, I think sometimes we do forget that, we can build by thinking about local and cultural, norms. For example, in Senegal, usually the way we build peace is sit under the palabra tree and have a conversation. That's how the Casamance peace was built. And I think that as we move forward in building tech solutions and offline, online, giving online access, and online access to people, we need to think about what is the basic thing that we could give to people to make them, to have peaceful tools. And I think that we need to start thinking about that very carefully now. And I think that as your opening question was, can tech be, is just elitist, is it just for the elites or for the people living in urban places? No, because lack of peace is really in villages, in places where, you can't speak to your mayor, you can't speak to the local people, you can't go to your, council office to speak to the right people. And I think when we're building tools, we need to start thinking about, offline, online, the cultural norms, and sit down with the chief of the village, for example, and asking him, the things we can do to build tools. And usually you find those are the best way, for example, of building ethical tools. And I'm really pushing right now on ethical tools and tools that the local people can use, because I'm just worried that we're going to be building tools for peace, for justice, for gender equality, for everything we want. But if we don't think about localizing them, talking and asking people what they need, we're just going to have a bank of applications, bank of solutions that doesn't serve anything. And I think we need to bear in mind that we need to think about that very carefully as we build and design tools for the future.
I think you're absolutely right to raise this idea of building tools from the ground, and I thought maybe I could also provide two examples. One of work we've done, one of work that I've seen. There's this great website called swatna.net, and it's run by a Sudanese nonviolent activist, and it's for Sudanese nonviolent activists. And it basically runs through all sorts of different simple tools, including WhatsApp, but also Indiegogo and Twitter and all sorts of things, and talks about how those can be used for peaceful activism in Sudan. And I find those kind of initiatives where activists kind of spell out how to use what's already out there and adapt it to local conditions and to local context, very powerful, probably amongst the most powerful work done in the space of technology and peace building. The second thing is, we kind of work in places where people think that working with technology is a crazy idea. Like, for example, we recently did a project on the border between Sudan and South Sudan, where it's not that there's no mobile phone network, there's no electricity. No electric grid. There is electricity, but runoff of generators. It's all about thinking about what is relevant and appropriate there. And so the project we ended up doing on the border between Sudan and South Sudan was a project to have local people make their own films that told the story of trade across the border. And so the technology, if you want, was digital cameras. And they went around and they made these incredible films over 3 weeks. They're available online if you want to watch them. When I show them at talks, people think they're professionally made. The people who made them can't read and write. They'd never touched a camera before. But people learn technology really fast, especially if you tell them that it's theirs. And if you basically sit around and say, okay, here's a camera, let's all talk about how we can use it and what this can do to build peace. One of the things that, and this is going to your simple solutions thing, one of the things we found, because it's great to make a film, and then we had a screening on a football field, and that was fantastic. But that's a one-off thing. So how do we get these films to more people? So they're now touring the film along the border. But we thought, is there a way that we can distribute this film even more? So in markets in South Sudan, because you can't charge your phone practically anywhere, there are these little stands that have generators, and you basically pay a very small amount of money to charge your mobile phone. So if you've ever been to actually a lot of places that are off the grid, this is quite a common thing, right? The other thing you can do at these stands is you can pay a little bit more money and you can download a video onto your phone. It doesn't have to be a smartphone, it can be just a Java-enabled phone, and mostly people are downloading clips of Messi's latest goal in the Spanish league or whatever. So it's mostly football, sports films. Sometimes small clips from different music videos, etc. So what we're trying to figure out now is, can we get those little shacks that are doing this to actually distribute our films also onto mobile phones? By the way, if you're wondering how they do that, they just Bluetooth them on there. So they have some guy drives to a place with internet, gets them onto his laptop, comes back to the place, running the generator to run the laptop, and then Bluetooths the films from the laptop onto the mobile phone. I say that because people sometimes look at me funny when I mention these examples, like it's not actually possible, but people make up ways of using simple technologies also. Last question. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Steve Twigg. I've been researching at the LSE with the role of visual media and narrative in post-conflict reconciliation, so that was a really fascinating example. I was curious because there's quite a spectrum of peace in that definition that we're talking about. On one end, like a lack of violent crime, and on the other end, a lack of international war, if you will, anywhere in there. And I was curious about the concepts of sort of inter-community communication and accountability, and Mariéme mentioned sort of a democratic empowerment opportunity and that sort of thing. In that context of peace building, how do you see media playing a role? Thank you.
Okay. Mariéme, do you want to try and tackle that one first? Since he mentioned you.
Yeah, I just missed a little bit of the question. I don't know if you can repeat this time, please.
Yeah, I can try and repeat it. So, is that okay? Yeah. So he was mentioning how we've talked about peace all the way from crime in cities to lack of international war. And particularly, I think you're interested in hearing about opportunities for accountability and how accountability and peace are linked. Is that right?
And
Communication. Okay. So communication between communities, accountability, democratic empowerment, and how that's linked to peace building and particularly to uses of technology.
I mean, I can give an example of, my country, Senegal and Mali, and what's happening right now in Burkina Faso. And I also can probably give an example of what's happening in Libya. But I remember that in Libya, when Gaddafi was around, my government used to speak to Gaddafi quite a lot. And when we had we had a village in Senegal where everybody was going to Libya in that time. But because, we use the the Sufism way of really talking to people to stay home and to work together. And I think that sometimes there's accountability part of that. Who is the leader who's talking to the communities and to make them understand that what they're doing is wrong, or and just divert their thinking in difficult conditions. In Senegal, it's the same. When we have problem with, when we had issues from Leopold Sedar Senghor, who was from Casamance, and today, that's why we have peace in. We don't have total peace in Casamance, but I think that talking together, building communities, informing communities, educating them, giving them alternatives, can create a better communication for peace building. But also we need to make sure that we don't get too much involved into the peace building process. We need to give time to local people, local chiefs, to build their own communities. And sometimes, sadly, the West, we intervene so quickly, and then we don't give people alternatives, and then we create a big bombshell, and then let them, and leave them on their own to resolve the issues. And sometimes, one of the biggest conflicts, one of the biggest issues we have in the world is just, there's no alternative once we create problems for peace in many countries around the world. So, but I know that in Senegal, we sit under the Polarization, we discuss issues. That's why the Africa Guiding Platform was created, to make sure that people can sit down and share ideas for positive change. I think we need to start localizing these norms, these small details. In Senegal, we have made such a progress for terrorism, for so many things. For example, the Moorids, the Moorids people used to call them terrorists because they're the wealthiest people in Senegal. They contribute in Senegalese economy. But those people, you don't want them to go into war. You don't want to create problems with those people. But so many people hold those people into account. Talk to them, listen to them in a very peaceful way. And we're a very peaceful country.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Do either of you have other answers to that question?
Maybe a small and broad one, which is that, as I was saying earlier, that the internet and the web are these things set up to create this idea of like a global village, is kind of the phrase that was used before any of these things were invented. And this sounded kind of like science fiction at the time. And certainly if you remember the early internet before the web or even dial-up modems, suddenly we're here having a conversation with someone in New York, and it's kind of worked really well, weirdly. Doesn't normally, well done. So I think these technologies are designed with kind of this idea of creating a global village, of decentralized networks, of connecting people that are close to each other or really far away. So, and I think we get used to this sort of level of technology very, very quickly. And I think, hopefully, as technology improves, its role can increase in creating that kind of local, global community.
Yeah.
I can share an example as well in terms of dialogue between communities. Now, the multi-stakeholder validation groups, they meet every month to talk about, unreported incidences of conflict and to verify and validate. And this has become a platform for trust building and confidence building and information sharing as well among different representatives in the community. And it's interesting that we've seen a lot of, distrust and doubt when we started it between the police and community members and some of the NGOs, but as they regularly met and discussed the issues on the ground, we've seen some changes in terms of how they interact with each other. It's become more proactive and productive in thinking about solutions and in thinking about issues rather than blaming each other. So we've seen a lot of that happening as well. We have 3 validation groups, and we are thinking about bringing them together in terms of a more broader discussion about the transition of the Bangsamoro. So yeah, that's been our example in terms of that aspect.
I think it's interesting, the three answers that you gave, how they're quite different in terms of the scale of the type of connections, but I think that's quite reflective in a way of what we're seeing with technology. So on the one hand, you have hyper-local examples like what you just shared, some of what Mariéme was sharing, or the South Sudan thing I was talking about before. But then you also have this global thing about the sort of global village, and I have an example about that I think is quite interesting. There was a lot, you can actually read about this on, I think it was the BBC who did an article about it. When in April, I think, of last year, the fiber optic cable from Kenya arrived in Mogadishu, and the kind of cultural shock, the culture shock that a lot of people were in, who suddenly were able to basically click on a YouTube link and watch it immediately, and therefore were watching lots of YouTube videos and going onto lots of websites they hadn't been on before. And the effect that had on people in Mogadishu of suddenly being connected and being part of something bigger. And there are a lot of problems with the kind of networks that we create that reinforce views, and we heard Jimmy Wales talk about that before. But I think there's also a great power in being connected to the world in that kind of slightly abstract but actually quite concrete way as well. So yeah, I think we're going to end on that question. Before we invite you to join you for pizza and beers, I was hoping you could give a big round of applause to the panelists, but also to the International Alert team and volunteers that are around and have handed out bags and have made the technology work, and I'm sure have done loads of other things to make this event happen. So can we have a big round of applause? Bearing with us and with the technology. And now, if you would like to join us, Andy, are we going through that? So through the red door, and I think you'll see what is out there. Thank you.
Yeah, you can speak directly there.
Hey, Mariéme, I'm not sure I can hear you.